In the spring of 1851, a fire tore through a county records office in South Carolina. Flames climbed the walls, paper curled into ash, and clerks formed human chains, passing ledgers hand to hand, trying to save whatever they could. Most of the records survived, but one set of books never needed saving, because they had already been sealed away inside an iron safe. 3 days later, when the smoke had cleared, that safe was opened, and inside was not what anyone expected. Not tax reports, not land disputes, not routine plantation accounts, but something else. A collection of records so precise, so methodical, that the man reading them would later describe it as evil that had learned to keep perfect accounts. His name was William Prescott, a state auditor, a man sent there to do something simple: verify numbers, check property values, move on. Instead, he sat alone in a temporary office, turning page after page, and realizing that he was reading a story no one had ever intended to hide. Because the horror wasn't buried, it wasn't implied, it wasn't hidden between the lines. It was written clearly, dated, organized, cross-referenced, year after year after year. And at the center of it was a woman named Celia. Born into slavery, listed in inventory, raised inside the walls of a plantation house, where she would spend the next 4 decades of her life, not as a person, but as something else entirely. At first, the entries seemed ordinary: rice yields, weather patterns, purchases, births. But then Prescott noticed something, a pattern. The same name, appearing again and again and again. Celia, followed by dates, followed by children. No fathers listed, just descriptions: healthy, light complexion, strong. Neutral words, clinical words, words that reduced life to inventory. But the deeper he read, the harder it became to ignore what those words meant. Because this wasn't just record keeping, this was something else, something deliberate. A system so normalized, so carefully maintained, that the people responsible felt no need to hide it at all. And as Prescott turned another page, he realized something that made him stop reading entirely. Because this wasn't the story of one man. It wasn't even the story of one generation. This was something that stretched across decades, across a family. 3 generations, linked together by one name, written over and over and over again. Celia. And the deeper he went, the clearer it became that what he was holding in his hands was not just a record of a plantation. It was a record of something far worse. When Prescott kept reading, the pattern began to take shape. Not all at once, not in a single entry, but slowly, line by line, like something revealing itself only to those willing to keep looking. The earliest references to Celia appeared in the late 1820s. She was listed as a house servant, young, healthy, promising, a word that appeared often in plantation records. Promising didn't mean potential, it meant value. It meant usefulness. By that time, the plantation was owned by a man named Marcus Ashford. He was educated, respected, a man who kept detailed journals about everything: weather, soil conditions, crop yields, and occasionally about Celia. At first, his words were careful, measured, almost clinical. She has matured into a useful servant. She learns quickly. She understands her place. Phrases that sounded ordinary until you understood what they were preparing for. Because in 1826, the tone changed. Not dramatically, not violently, just subtly. Marcus began writing about arrangements, about utility beyond domestic service, about matters that required discretion, but not apology. He never used the word. He didn't have to, because the next entry said everything. May 1827. Celia, delivered of a daughter, healthy, light complexion. No father listed. But Prescott already knew, because Marcus had written it somewhere else, in a private journal, never meant to be read publicly. That separation mattered. In the official ledger, the truth was hidden, but not erased. In his private writing, Marcus recorded it plainly, not as a crime, not as violence, but as a decision, a management choice. Celia was 16. Marcus was in his 40s, married, a father, a man respected in his community. And under the law, there was nothing illegal about what he had done, because Celia was not considered a person. She was property, and property could not refuse. Over the next few years, the entries continued. 1829, another child. 1831, another. Each one recorded the same way, same structure, same detached language. Healthy, valuable, noted. No father. But always the same description. Light. A detail that said everything without ever needing to say it directly. Marcus never expressed doubt, never questioned himself. In his journals, he wrote about Celia the same way he wrote about crops. Reliable, productive. At one point, he described her children as appreciating assets. Not lives, not family. Assets. Something that increased in value over time. And he wrote it down, carefully, consistently. Hesitation. Because in his world, this wasn't something to hide. It was something to manage. Something to document. Something to pass on. And that was the part Prescott hadn't fully understood yet. Because as he turned the next pages, he began to see that Marcus Ashford wasn't just recording a system. He was preparing someone else to continue it. The next entries introduced a new name. Robert Ashford, Marcus's son. At first, he appeared only in passing, away at school, returning home, learning the business. The normal path of a young man being prepared to inherit everything. Land, wealth, power. But Prescott began to notice something else. Marcus wasn't just teaching Robert how to run a plantation. He was teaching him how to think, how to see people as property, how to justify it, how to live with it. In one journal entry, Marcus wrote about his son returning from Charleston. Too much reading, too many ideas. Ideas that needed to be corrected. Because according to Marcus, true mastery required more than knowledge. It required exercising all forms of authority, even the ones not discussed in polite company. That line made Prescott stop, because by now he understood exactly what it meant, and the next entry confirmed it. February 1834. Celia, delivered of a son, healthy, fair complexion. This time, there was a name beside it. Father, Robert Ashford. No attempt to hide it, no omission. Just written plainly, as if it were something to be noted and moved on from. Celia was 24. Robert was barely a man. And whatever hesitation he may have felt didn't last long. Because Prescott found Robert's own journal beginning that same year. At first, the tone was uncertain. I find these matters difficult. I struggle to reconcile them with Christian teaching. Words that suggested he knew something was wrong. But then, the language changed. Slowly, gradually, until it became indistinguishable from his father's. Necessary arrangements. Proper authority. I must learn to see property as property. And with that, the struggle ended. Not because the truth had changed, but because he had learned how to ignore it. The entries that followed were colder, cleaner, more efficient, more confident. Celia continued to appear year after year. More children, more entries, more records. And now, 2 generations were tied to her, father and son, both using the same language, both treating the same woman as the same thing. But there was someone else in the house, someone who saw all of it. Marcus's wife, Robert's mother, Catherine Ashford. She lived in the same rooms, walked the same halls, watched Celia grow, watched the children be born, watched their faces begin to resemble the men in her own family. And she said nothing, at least not out loud. Prescott found one of her letters, buried among the records. Carefully written, carefully worded. She described the plantation as following patterns common to our region, patterns that troubled her, but were not hers to question. Because the law gave her husband authority, and her role was to maintain order. That was how the system survived, not just through violence, but through silence, through people who saw, understood, and chose not to act. By the time Marcus died, the pattern was no longer new. It was established, documented, accepted. And when Robert took control of the plantation, he didn't change it. He continued it, expanded it, perfected it. Celia kept appearing in the records, older now, weaker, but still useful, still productive, still there. And as Prescott turned the next pages, he realized something that made everything worse. Because this pattern wasn't stopping with Robert. It was already reaching the next generation. What Prescott found next was the moment the pattern stopped being just repetition and became something far worse. Because the names weren't just repeating across generations anymore. They were beginning to overlap. He turned to the birth records again, carefully, slowly, tracing names, dates, relationships. And then he saw it. An entry from 1850. Sarah, delivered of a daughter, healthy, light complexion. Father, Robert Ashford. Prescott didn't move. Because Sarah was Celia's daughter, born in 1827, and Robert had fathered her, which meant he had now fathered a child with his own daughter. The ledger didn't react. It didn't pause. It didn't explain. It simply continued, line after line, as if this was still part of the same system, still part of the same logic. Prescott closed his eyes, just for a moment. But when he opened them, it got worse. Because the pattern had not reached its limit. It was still evolving. Another entry, this one more recent. 1859. Celia, delivered of a daughter, healthy, fair complexion. Father, James Ashford. James, Robert's son. Marcus's grandson. 3 generations, grandfather, father, son, all tied to the same name, Celia. By now, she was nearly 50 years old. Her body, already worn down by decades of labor, by years of childbirth, by a life that had never been her own. And still, she appeared in the records, still listed, still counted, still used. Prescott found the journal entry that explained it, written by Robert. "I have determined to educate my son as my father educated me." The words were calm, measured, almost instructional. This is part of mastery, part of maintaining order. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just continuation, a tradition, passed down, like land, like wealth, like inheritance. And Celia was the bridge between them, the constant, the one thing that never changed. Prescott flipped through the remaining pages, faster now, looking for something, anything, that suggested someone had tried to stop it. A note, a correction, a moment of doubt. There was nothing. Only more entries, more births, more names. And a system that had become so normalized, so completely accepted, that it no longer even tried to hide itself. Because it didn't have to. Everything Prescott was reading was legal, protected, enforced. And as he reached the final pages, the realization settled in fully. This wasn't just a story about one family. It was proof of what the system allowed, what it protected, what it normalized for decades. And now it was written down, impossible to deny, but also impossible to punish. And that was where the story became even more dangerous. When Prescott closed the final ledger, he didn't move. The room was quiet, too quiet. Outside, the county was still rebuilding from the fire, people carrying wood, repairing walls, restoring what had been lost. But inside that room, nothing had been restored. Something had been exposed. And there was nothing he could do about it, because everything he had just read was legal. No law had been broken. No crime, as the state defined it, had taken place. Celia could not refuse. She could not testify. She could not leave. And the men who used her had done so with complete protection. Prescott tried anyway. He wrote a report, carefully, precisely. 12 pages documenting everything. Dates, names, entries. He didn't accuse, he didn't exaggerate. He simply wrote down what was already there. And at the end, he asked a question. What does it mean that this is allowed? That this can be written, preserved, repeated across generations, without consequence? He sent the report, waited, and 3 weeks later, he got his answer. A short reply, cold, dismissive. This is outside your authority. These are lawful matters. Return to your duties. That was it. No investigation, no response, no acknowledgement of what he had found. The system had no interest in examining itself. So Prescott did the only thing he could. He copied the records, line by line, entry by entry, and he kept them, Because if the law refused to see it, then maybe someone in the future would. Back on the plantation, nothing changed. The ledgers continued, the system continued, and Celia continued to disappear into the role those pages had created for her. She died in 1854. No long entry marked it, no reflection, no pause. Just a single note, expired, followed by another line. A replacement would be purchased. That was all. 30 years, 15 children, 3 generations, reduced to a line in a book, and then replaced. The plantation itself would not survive much longer. The war would come. The system would collapse. The men who built it would die. The land would change hands. The buildings would decay. And eventually, almost everything would disappear. Except the records. Because those pages survived. They sat in archives, unread, ignored, until someone decided to look. And that's what makes this story different. Not because it was rare, but because it was written down. Carefully, confidently, by the men who believed they would never be questioned. And for a long time, they were right. So now the question isn't what happened. We know that. The question is what we do with the fact that it did. Because somewhere, in a set of ledgers that survived a fire, a woman named Celia still exists. Not as she lived, not as she felt, but as she was recorded. And whether we choose to look at those records or look away is no longer up to them. It's up to us.